Welcome to the latest episode of Skytale Insights. My name is James Turcott, partner here at Skytale, and I'm joined by our CEO and founder, Ben Hernandez, as well as two friends of the firm in Michael Byrd and Brad Adatto from BrydAdatto. Thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having us in the studio. This is quite spectacular for those watching in TV land.
Feels special.
Yes.
Thanks for coming. It's fun, always fun to be live. And so, obviously I've known y'all for a long time and, happy to finally get you in here. So, with that, I'll kick it to our founder, Ben, and, we can kind of dive right in.
Yeah, so first, Michael, Brad, I know everyone knows you, but maybe for anyone who doesn't, would you mind giving a brief intro on yourselves and/or ByrdAdatto?
Yes, senior, age before beauty.
Yes,
again?
Exactly.
Okay.
And speak up. You're old. They might not be able to hear you.
Okay, well, that's your hearing. I'm Michael, and Michael Byrd. I'm an attorney here in Dallas, Texas, with the law firm BrydAdatto. I'm the CEO of BrydAdatto. Brad, who you're about to meet, and I founded BrydAdatto about 9 years ago.
A little over 9 years.
But we've been practicing together for 17 years. My dad's a plastic surgeon. In 1995, I started practicing law and really found myself gravitating towards representing doctors, and in particular in the aesthetic world. And so my practice kind of started there, and I did a lot of different things as a young attorney. Brad was kind of doing the same thing. He can talk about that, but we met when he was displaced by Hurricane Katrina and decided that we both did things that no other attorneys really did, which is focus on representing doctors on the business side, and thought that we had something that we could grow together. He had a lot more heavy compliance background, which I did not, and so I was super thankful to have.
Were you thankful?
Well,
That's a catch-22, right?
that's more of a philosophical question. Well, I need a couch. It immediately our practice skyrocketed from the beginning, because we had been building things separately, and the moment we came together, it was like rocket fuel. And we started BrydAdatto about 9 years because our practice had gotten to the point where we felt like we needed our own kind of business platform to do it. We have built our business through education. We've been lecturing around the country at continuing medical education type conferences.
And I think sometimes y'all are up there with us.
Yes,
Sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, I recognize y'all.
Yeah.
So that's a little of our story. I'll let Brad.
Yeah, and much like Michael, I did grow up. My father on the other side of the world was an orthopedic surgeon, so I grew up in that household from that perspective. And like Michael, I've been in this for not as long as Michael. Michael's been practicing since dinosaurs were kind of roaming, but so just a few years later than Michael, but basically 100% of the time I've been in the healthcare industry. And then, as Michael said, we kind of joined forces back in 2006. I've been working together ever since. But for those not familiar with the firm, to the point is 100% of what we do is business law. It just happens to be the vast majority of our clients, probably more than 85%, are in the healthcare industry. And because of that, we understand how to fold healthcare rules and regulations on top of your typical business rules, which allows us to kind of grow in almost every single season of a business.
Excellent. Thank you both. And I actually learned something today. If I ever want to talk to the CEO of the company, I'm calling Michael Byrd.
Yes. And if you want a good answer, you can call me as well.
That part I did know, so I didn't learn that today.
Yes.
I've known that for some time. So, our firms work together pretty closely, and, especially in the medical aesthetic space, which is where I think we want to focus on today, we run the gamut. We run the gamut from the perspective from our side on the consulting side. When we're working with our mutual clients on growing and scaling them, you come in and really make sure that they're prepared to do so from a legal perspective. And then on the investment banking side, we've worked on a number of sell-side deals together as well. And I know from our perspective, it's been fascinating to see how, whether it's the sins as they're building their company or if they do it well, what that means when it's time to transact from a value perspective, from a risk to close perspective. So I'd love to talk about that just to really make sure that people understand that what you do on the front end matters throughout the business life cycle all the way through sales. So from a legal lens, I'm sure you guys see the same thing. What are some, maybe start with the top thing and we'll go from there. What are some things that you see from a legal perspective that you've seen, okay, if they're set up correctly or not, whatever it may be, it'll affect you throughout and down the road all the way to exit?
I'll start with the regulatory piece, Michael. But a lot of times when you start a business, you might be set up perfectly clean. You had counsel involved, you structured it correctly, but then you started growing. You started adding additional services, additional providers. You started adding that RN, that MA, and as you grew, although you're compliant at the very beginning, you start kind of drifting out of compliance. Then you add a third site, a fourth site. So as you're scaling, you forgot the reason why you had to be structured in a particular way, or a new management comes in place and another new manager, and there's some loss in that telephone game as to why we did it this way. And so fast forward 5 or 6 years later, you're no longer doing clearance of the patients correctly, and you forgot why you had to do it that way. And that's something we see often, is that when we get pulled in and they say, I want to grow this more, or I want to get ready for a particular sale, we'll see that they were compliant at some point, but then slowly, and not purposely, and it's not like they meant to, they just kind of drifted out of that compliance. And so a lot of times it's us trying to get them back to be sales ready, right, to be there. And I know there's other stuff that we do, but that's just an easy one.
Yeah, and on the compliance too, to his point about drifting out of compliance, it actually, our clients resonate. It resonates with them when you start talking about it, because their role when they're running a business is other things. If they're a doctor, they're focused on treating patients, and so they may know that they need to deal with this thing that they don't really want to deal with, like keeping things done correctly. Even on their staffing, their primary role is more operations focused. Most small businesses don't have a compliance officer. Yeah. And so when they get to the scaling season, they're inevitably going to have some level of skeletons in the closet that need to be cleaned up. And then it becomes the point from our perspective of, how do you convince them that it's going to be beneficial for them to do this? And again, it depends on the type of, are you talking to someone who's glass half empty, and so they're worried about what would happen if they don't do it, and so it's, a little bit of what's the risk to my business if I don't fix this, and it's the negative consequence type conversation. And so we'll talk through that. Oftentimes, if they've talked to you guys and they're getting excited and have a vision to scale and sell, it's much easier, because then you can talk about, well, here, if you do this, it's going to equip you to, be more marketable and get through the M&A sales side without, and maximize the value of what you can extract.
So how frequently are you revisiting that structure? Like, is it every time they want to open a new location, every time they want to acquire, like from an outsourced compliance officer, if you will? Like, how are you translating that to them? And because it's a reinvestment again, like you're going through that process again and again and again. So what does that look like? And when does it really even matter for you to revisit it?
Well, ideally, we create just an overarching almost culture of compliance in the way they think about it. And when we're working with our clients, we want that continuity in our conversation. And so they may not even realize when we're asking questions that we're looking for cracks that may have happened. And so, in a 1 month period, it's very unlikely that something's going to happen. But probably on a quarterly, twice a year basis, we're making sure, if we haven't talked to our ongoing relationship-based clients, that we're checking in and learning kind of what they've been up to and looking forward.
Perfect.
Very good. So compliance is one. I know certainly from our end, we see it and we talk about it from a business perspective of, especially our clients who tend to be scaling and growing. as they grow, as they scale, there are more eyeballs on them, from competitors as well as, state regulatory environment type of perspective. So that for us is important. And certainly from a sell side perspective, I think you've seen this as well. Buyers are becoming more aware and more strict on this piece because they do see that the medical aesthetic space is growing at such a high pace. And there are so many investors, there are so many other people coming into the space that certainly, the regulatory environment certainly not going to loosen. And I think that, investors don't like risks. So this is going to be one of the key pieces, I think, going forward.
Yeah, and I know that we've heard other private equity say this, which is, hey, we already have a big target on our back. And when we come in and acquire someplace, we'd rather have a place that's either already compliant or in the process of getting compliant, because we don't want to go to market and keep growing and growing and have a whole bunch of non-compliant places. And I think we all probably in this room know situations where someone looked great on paper and then they started getting deeper into it, and the private equity group saw all these issues that were unquantifiable risks that they just kind of, I'm going to go to the next guy, and maybe when you get your house in order, maybe we can talk again, because they have that dry powder.
Yes.
Because what's the market like right now?
It's pretty frothy.
Oh, right.
A lot of tailwinds.
A lot of tailwinds. and so for the audience to understand, that means is like they have money to deploy. They want to buy places, and the cleaner your practice is, just we can start with that first piece, that compliance piece. The easier it is for you guys, obviously, probably to take in the market, and from us to bless it from the compliance perspective that their house is in order.
And I would say, for the size of deals in this space, most of the time you're not seeing escrowed monies, but the times that we do, it's usually because there's a compliance problem that's pending, and they're trying to, hold back cash to deal with that investigation and the costs that would potentially be going with that.
Mm-hmm.
That is a great point. So yes, not only does it affect the potential for a deal to close, and you're right, Brad, we both have had stories there, unfortunately. And then you're right, Michael, if they do choose to close over that risk, then somehow private equity is going to be made whole, and it's the escrow holdback money, which means that you don't get as much cash up front as you would have had you done things right at the beginning.
Yeah,
Right.
and we have a deal that is ongoing that because of compliance, we still don't have a closing date, and we're, almost a year, it seems like, into this thing where LOI is executed, due diligence is done, most of the purchase agreement is been completed, but because of some lingering compliance concerns, we can't get this deal closed until all of that is cleaned up, because the buyer does not want it to be a post-closing obligation. They want it to be a pre-closing. So again, going back to getting that cash in your pocket, if you had this lingering issue and you want to sell, this thing can drag on.
And then talk about fatigue on that front.
Oh, gosh.
You're updating all that data. You're praying that your business continues to trend in the right direction and that it doesn't have a downturn. So, you're just delaying, that closing, and there's a lot more execution risk that kind of goes into that. So fatigue is a real factor.
And I have a funny, kind of, not haha funny, but funny story.
We may laugh.
Yes.
We'll be the judge of that.
So I had a client that it's a kind of a perfect scenario for what we're talking about. They hired us when they're ready to scale, and they knew they were not compliant. They were extremely successful, med spa, multiple location, in a state that has corporate practice of medicine, and they were RN owned. And so for those in the audience that don't know, that's a compliance issue in many states, and it's a very easy solution through the MSO model. And they needed this to start getting themselves ready to execute on their vision to sell. And so we put it all together. They got distracted, and it dragged on. They didn't want to go through the operational changes to implement the MSO, even though everything was ready. And then we get a call that they have a deal. They have a letter of intent signed, and not only do they have that, but the owner's cousin is an M&A attorney at a small firm, and they've been doing it. And so they pull us in like literally 3 weeks before closing, if not 2 weeks before closing. And the buyer is asking all these questions that they don't know how to answer. And so I find out for the first time that they had not implemented the MSO. And so this compliance problem became, came out in the deal, and the deal fell apart completely. The buyer at first started delaying things. That's what made me think of you when you were talking about the deal fatigue. And everyone was like, okay, well, this was supposed to close in 3 weeks, and it's like, 4 months later, and it's been crickets. And then they just kind of very unceremoniously bailed. And so this was a $14 million transaction that went from $14 million to zero, not to mention the legal fees they spent on the cousin. And so then they had to reboot and get it going, and then they did finally sell. So that's the fun part, is they did sell, but there was a clear economic cost. The sales price was not the same.
Yeah.
The second
Yeah.
time.
So, that's a good story. Well, sad good story.
Yeah.
So be compliant.
Yes.
And so that's great. Okay, let's move on. What's another example beyond compliance that you guys tend to see?
I'd say structure. The structure of he kind of was alluding to it. For the audience member who wasn't keeping up, he was referencing the core practice of medicine, which is basically a state doctrine that prohibits corporations from employing physicians. So that's, and in states where that is there's about 25 states out there that have that. In states that do enforce that, that means that non-physicians can't directly own it, kind of like the RN, as you were describing, Michael. But that means that there has to be another entity involved. That's typically called the MSO, Management Service Organization. So the first thing is, what does your structure look like? Are you compliant from that perspective? Because if you're not, that's the structuring aspect of having that MSO, having that contract between the MSO and the professional entity, which is called the MSA. So that's an aspect of it. But then you can dive deeper into it, which is then like, what type of entity did you form? Did you form a corporation, an Inc.? Did you form an LLC? Because both of those have different tax impacts, which then can impact how you're running your business from a tax perspective, and then who can invest in the business. I mean, a perfect example that he and I got pulled into, client out of California, they had an LLC that was their MSO, and they taxed it as an S corp, even though they had multiple partners in it, meaning that it was more than one person. Well, they had an outside investor who wanted to put substantial money into the MSO, because it was in California. This investor was not a physician, so they couldn't directly do it. And because so much money was going through this active MSO, they had to pause the influx of cash to do something called an S inversion. And trust me, I will not bore anyone in this room what that means.
I don't even know what that means.
I just fell asleep for a second.
Yeah.
But the point for the audience
Wait,
to
what do we
understand,
do?
wake up, Ben.
Sorry.
Is it that then delayed it by months?
Yeah.
Because we had to do a lot of legal logistics, and they had always intended to have outside investors go in. But when the doctor started, his CPA goes, you're just going to own it, make it an S corp. Like, never thought, I think partnership actually works better for this MSO, or maybe consider C corp. Like, there are other tax avenues, and so when you are structuring it, have a pause. Don't just rush into it. And I think you always use a line, when you start your business, what should you think about?
The end in mind.
The end in mind. God, he's so good at
Wow,
this.
you read his mind. Look at
And
that.
for that perspective, if someone had asked that question, they would say S corp makes no sense in this particular case, and then it delayed it by months. And they were trying to get it closed by before the end of the year for tax purposes. There was no way to do it because of all the filings that had to happen.
And I was just gonna say, from a growth strategy perspective, like and that kind of goes back to like how do you revisit it every time you're doing something new, because something different of we're taking outside capital versus a physician or whatever it is, and being able to kind of understand when we set out on that path, like that growth strategy and what we do. I think you just bring up a really good point of there's so many different inflection points of a business and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish, that it can throw that structure for a loop at the end of the day.
For sure. And when you start scaling, that to me implies beyond normal growth. Like, there's a strategy in play. And oftentimes, I know for you guys, it's to, get them to an end of going to market. And one of the things structure-wise that we'll see sometimes, and you guys know this, a lot of times when a business is ready to scale, they'll start doing some things on the financial accounting side, like they'll go to accrual-based accounting.
Yep.
Well, that actually can impact the structure. So you may be an MSO model, and have, kind of a cash-based accounting and have a nice rhythm of how things go, and the accrual thing can actually wreak havoc on the structure, and you want to make some adjustments to how you set that up.
Are there any other fancy accounting words you want to use for this podcast?
Well, I'll let them explain what that is, because I can't actually say
I thought you said
anything more than the word accrual.
I thought you said cash or cruel, and I didn't understand anything in between.
Cash or cruel. Love it. Yeah, no, we see all of that as well. And it's such an important piece. I mean, the MSO piece just fascinates me, period. I mean, from a legal perspective and then from a business perspective, you talked about it. And this is where I think it's a good lesson for all of us to stay in very close touch, because whatever your financial side is doing, whatever your accounting side is doing, really bleeds into the legal structure of it, right? Because I know we've seen clients that are growing their businesses that, you give them all the MSO docs and, it sits like on their coffee table because it's as thick as a book. Sometimes it feels like, and you have to put those things in place because there are different pieces that live in the MSO versus the actual practices, and the financial side should follow that. And even the compliance and regulatory side should follow that. So it's really fascinating to me how tightly bound all of that is. And it gives tremendous flexibility from a business side, because you can get into things like you're talking about scaling, growing businesses. You can get into things like partnerships and who can own where. There's a lot of flexibility there. Brad, you talked about the entity, the tax structures that are in place. We recently had one that was the opposite of you, where it was a C Corp, and he got basically double tax there at the end, and it wasn't beautiful. So we had to do a lot of work with the buyer in order to get somewhere that was mutually beneficial. So MSO is absolutely right.
Yeah.
I'd be curious too, just from y'all's perspective. So someone comes in and they're ready to grow, and let's say they have going to market in mind. Like, what are the initial steps you guys from your lens are thinking about?
I can go first. I mean, firstly, I think it's what do you want? Where do you want to be at the end of the road, and how long do you want it to take? Because there's, some people say I want to have $100 million sale in 2 years, and it's like, great. Like, let's be realistic here, and what does that actually look like? And so I think figuring out what does the end in mind look like at the end of the day, but then what is the gray space that it takes between there? Like, are you going to partner, physicians? Are you going to partner injectors? Are you going to open new locations? Are you going to acquire? Or are you going to open brand new locations? There's different aspects of the business along the way that you're stacking onto it to grow EBITDA ultimately. Like, that's how you're going to be valued. And so how do we efficiently stack EBITDA, integrate the practices, make sure that there's sound systems in place going from location 1 to 3. 3 is where we see businesses really break and rebuild. And then you're going from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, probably another breaking point, and you're just constantly tweaking. And so really our goal is to map that out at the end of the day and get people comfortable with, you're going to have to reinvest, you're going to feel pain, but it's good pain. And it's pain that you're doing because you're trying to get to kind of that next level of things. And I'm sure Ben has some thoughts on that too.
No, I think that was good. I mean, it's pretty similar to your
He
wife.
thinks it's good, by the way.
Thinks it's good.
I think so. I'll rethink it later. No, it's not too different from your whiteboard meetings, actually, where we're really asking them, like, what really are you trying to do, which is what James mentioned. And there's a very different approach if someone says, I'm a physician and I have one location and that's all I want. That's relatively easy. If someone says, I'm a physician, I want to get to 10 locations, I might partner my COO, I might partner my injectors. Okay, we need to call Michael and Brad, mainly Michael. But yeah, so that's exactly right, is really just know the end in mind. And yeah, I think you were going to say something.
Well, no, and you can cut this later if you don't like it, but Ben had a good point earlier, was a lot of people silo their CPAs, their lawyers, their financial planning, and so they bring Skytale in, but you never talk to their attorneys, or they bring us in, and we don't even know who's helping them on the consulting side. And what Ben had said earlier was, like, as you're building this, make sure if you are doing a whiteboard or something like that, where you're structuring out the future, that all the team players that you need, if it are in that room, so they're all can have their input, so that if some attorney's like, oh, make this a C corp, and the CPA is like, hey, that's going to be a double tax on the sales side later.
100%.
That could be a big issue. Versus, let's go with a partnership, and here's why. And I think that'll be better. And then you guys are like, oh, and when we go to the third one, we kind of want to break this and add a new contract. Totally. Those are the kind of things that we can start working together. So for the audience members, thinking about growing, make sure you're not siloing your experts who are helping you get there.
And the industry's evolving too. So I always use the word sophisticated. Like as the years go on, it's going to get more sophisticated. People are going to figure out better ways to do things. So you're going to have to constantly keep up with the next movement of things and the next wave of things, which is why keeping the team all together really makes sense. And Michael and I are working on a project, and we hop on a call, and it's Michael, it's us, it's their CPA, it's their ops people, and so everyone is in tandem from that perspective and knowing what's going to happen to get to that next iteration and the next phase. So I mean, it speaks volumes for sure.
I mean, if you think about it, almost any decision you make in a business, it's going to have a legal impact. It's going to have an accounting impact, a tax impact, and financial. They can all be one bucket, and then an operational impact. And if we're advising someone, for example, to go into the MSO, but we're not talking to them about, making sure that ducks are in a row on how this is going to impact your accounting and tax, or how your team is going to be impacted by how you run things and where you employ people, then it's doomed to fail.
Yeah, and to add on that real quick is that lawyers are really good at putting the forms together. Here's the document that you need. And we can spend the time, and hopefully your attorney will spend the time talking about from an operational perspective what you need to do. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, we're not going to be holding your hand. And that's why, from you guys, from the consulting side, y'all obviously understand that piece of it, being able to hold their hand and make sure, yes, are you flowing your funds correctly? Your payroll needs to be done this way, or whatever it ends up being, because now you have two different entities and because the flow of funds are going in different directions.
I'm curious. Yeah. I always laugh because the pushback we get is, I don't want to pay for another tax return when they talk about entities and splitting it out. And so I'm sure you guys have heard it because you guys both laugh, but yes. It's always just a fascinating pushback to where, I don't know, it's $1,500, $2,000 to move the business forward. And it's always fascinating.
I think it's psychological.
It is.
I mean, it's like some people, they like the vision of having an empire and they want to form an entity for everything they do.
Yep.
And then some are like, this is complicating my life so much. I want to keep it simple. And so that one, they focus on the next tax return.
Well, that's another form example. We had a client that was getting ready to sell to a junior partner, and he kept talking about his 3 different businesses. So plastic surgeon, he had an ambulatory surgery center, he had a med spa, and then his practice where he did all the surgery out of. And he kept talking about it. And Michael spent some time going through the P&L. All the money was going through his practice. So the ASC had zero money in it, and the med spa had zero money in it. Even though he had 3 different entities, never once did his team ever
move the money.
Yes. And that's not uncommon.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that your legal speaks with your financial side and everything in between. Ultimately, you as a client should think about the fact that you want everybody on the same page, rowing with you. So 2 really good ones so far: compliance, MSO, and we went through a few phases of the MSO and the way that they could help you out. What's another thing that you guys see?
I have one that'll just be really close to your heart, Ben. Employment. Ben's our resident employment expert.
Yes. Yes, he is.
So, I mean, in all seriousness, you're getting ready to grow, and everyone's probably starting to get the picture. You get to this moment in time and you're kind of taking a breath. You're taking stock, and this whole idea of drifting, well, you do the drifting with employees as well. And so, do you have employment agreements? Should you have employment agreements? And if you're getting ready to go to market, there's a real conversation about getting all those things in a row. And then depending on when you're going to market, how much are you including them in the process, and there's a lot that goes into that as well. And then, beyond that, kind of at a more boring policy level, making sure handbooks and all that all your policies are in place and in line with how you actually do things. Mm-hmm. And again, it's, buyers are going to be looking at all of that. And I would say thematically that buyers either seem to be super focused on compliance or super focused on the team that they're inheriting.
They're the most important
That's
part
a
of the
great
practice.
And
And to add to the employment side, so going to the end in mind, if you know that you're building a model that in 5 years, 6 years, you're planning to sell, your employment agreements, most of the time people kind of follow the exact same vanilla thing. And they don't think about, well, what's in here? And so there's a section, and the miscellaneous is typically where you see it, where it talks about assignment. Generally speaking, you cannot assign the contract without the prior written permission of both parties. So boring legal talk, but that's important if you know that your end goal is to keep this core employees together. You want to build your employment agreements that it is assignable by the employer. So a lot of times in the bigger practices, bigger hospital systems, you'll see that assignment, meaning that that hospital can assign you to a different affiliate, or that a big group, if there is a sale, can assign your contract to the person who's getting, meaning that you don't even have to bring that employee along. It's an automatic piece. Big shift from the smaller mom and pops who either don't have a contract or all their contracts at both parties, because that adds a new flavor of trying to get all your team on board with this new potential sale at the end.
And that brings back some memories.
Yes.
The assignment piece. You know, we've had a few where there hasn't been. And I think one thing that's important to mention from an emotional perspective from anyone selling their business is your team.
Yeah.
And your team, you don't want them to be disrupted as much as you can do that. Because what happens is when they find out, they're going to Google, financial sponsors, whether it's private equity, family office, it doesn't matter. And they're going to make up their own mind as to what that means. And oftentimes they're going to say, my cousin said everything changes, whether that's true or not. And it's typically not in our spaces, fortunately, at least for them. But where there's not assignability, we've had buyers that have said, okay, well, now you have to sign this. Well, that to them is reinforcing what they assume, which is, I knew everything was going to change.
Right.
Because it's different than this one. There are a few different words, whatever it may be. So I think that part's really important, is to be paying attention to that, because what you don't want is disruption, because it can put your organization at risk, frankly.
It's an awesome point. I mean, to be able to go into a practice and say nothing's changed because you have an assignment language that says, yeah, your contract is just moving. Like, all it's going to change, we always say, is the emblem on the paycheck, really, at the end of the day. So, really good point.
And another aspect is, in this new world of deals happening, is now when businesses are starting to scale, they're usually hiring. And we're noticing, particularly over the last probably 8 to 9 months, recruiting with physicians, they're asking, are you planning to sell? And they're wanting to negotiate. They're wanting to pre-negotiate in their employment agreement what happens to them if you sell. And so there's, a carrot and a stick approach to that they're involved in, because they know sometimes that the intent is, in fact, to sell. Because that's the single doctor practice. They're like, oh, I need to go hire someone so I can become more marketable. Yeah. And so you're talking about non-competes on one hand for the stick approach, like how do you make sure that they are incentivized not to leave, but also, is there a financial reward for them agreeing to stay post-sale?
Yeah, we're seeing that in the space as well, from an injector being partnered or key people to retain them, right? Like there's the non-competes that whether or not they're able to be enforceable or not, but like from an equity standpoint, that's, enforceable at the end of the day, and you're a partner. And so, we've seen a lot of that start to come to the surface. And again, it goes back to sophistication, professionalizing, it's fun to kind of watch.
Yeah, and we have stories of the employer, for the employee, who is key to the closing, finding out the week of that he has a new agreement, and this person is sometimes the youngest doctor there, but the most productive doctor there, and it's like, I refuse to sign this. And so going back to, again, that delays the closing, and then there may, we've been on both sides of this, they may be asking for more money for a signing bonus, because they feel like if I have to be locked up for the next 5 to 6 years with this group, I want some guarantee money up front. And believe it or not, sellers, they don't realize that's going to come out of their grand total.
Yep.
So if that person's getting a $500,000 signing bonus, they're taking that out of your portion, not they're not increasing the purchase price.
Yeah.
That's great. So we have compliance, MSOs, employment agreement, labor law. I love it. What else?
I would say of the big three, I mean, we could probably get of those. We could double click on every single one of them and dive deeper in them, because those are the ones that we would be focused on as the structure, the compliance, and then those are the contracts. And contracts, we focused on employment, but that could be, do you have your lease? Because I'll say this, for those who don't know, if you're leasing multiple locations, if you are trying to get ready for a close, if you're telling your landlord the week of, you're so far behind, and depending how, going back to your words, sophisticated that landlord is, they may be like, oh, sure, here's our form, or they may be like, I want a piece of this. So we've seen it all over the place where landlords, especially with multiple locations, can actually slow down or almost not kill it, but make it a post-closing obligation because the landlord's so slow to respond. Yep. So that would be one that you just have to be mindful of, is what does your leases look like? And this is, I know you guys do this, but this is all about making sure that everyone knows what contracts you have. You might have equipment that has long lease terms on it. You may have other contracts you're not thinking about that you need to transfer. What's the ability to do that after the sale?
That's a great point. And if you want another glossary term, we here call it it's a long pole in the tent, lease assignments, because that always
Hold on, I'm writing that one down.
That always does seem to take longer. So that's another one that gives you memory. You know, you're bringing up good points, like all these things that are ancillary to the things we're talking about. And it brings back to mind something, Michael, that you said, which is have your handbooks be consistent, so on and so forth. That's a really important piece, isn't it, is to make sure that all of the things that you're doing, everything around it, like if these three things are the ecosystem of what we're talking about, let's say, that everything around it should also follow suit, whether it's handbooks, SOPs, so on and so forth. And, you know, this gets into legal, but also from an operational perspective, a buyer's going to look at that and see a very sophisticated business and that's running in the same way that they run it, right? Like, think of a business that has the things in place that we're talking about. If your team operationally, financially, so on, legally already operates as a mini version of what they do, that should be a very seamless transaction when it comes time to integration. I thought your handbook point was a good one.
Brad has the term form and substance tattooed on his back.
Yeah.
And that's really what you're
How do
getting.
you know?
Yeah. Oh, man.
Well, you take your shirt off every chance you get.
I've seen
The
this.
gun show.
Stage passes.
Everything comes down to your point, Ben, that you need to be doing what you're saying you're doing. If you print something off the internet, whether it's policies, corporate structure, contracts, and you aren't following it, you're usually creating more risk than if you had just done nothing. Yep. And when you're looking at scaling and getting ready for sale, that just heightens the importance.
And you mentioned this earlier, Ben, and I'm going to repeat it because the repeatable aspect, as to meaning that if I come along and take over you, it's really easy. It's repeatable. There's not anything new I have to do. Your business is more valuable because you have the people in place, so I can just move you under my big bucket, and there's not a lot of training, versus a group that's more dysfunctional. They don't have great SOPs. They're not used to following the rules on those employment agreements. That's harder transition, and these larger groups understand that. So now they're like, okay, is the value that as great? Maybe they have a great mixture of patients, but we're bringing on that team, or do we really want that team? And for most owners, because of that connection with their team, they want the team to be part of that post-closing world. And if you want that, make sure you have a great structure in place.
That's a great point, is the value there. And then also from an integration perspective, now you are going to maybe have to change a few things to get this going. So there's a bigger risk there, which goes right to your value point.
Mm-hmm.
So these are really great points. I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about at AmSpa's MSS, we're co-hosting an M&A day.
We are?
Which I know.
I forgot to tell Brad.
Yeah, that was our plan. Were we supposed to tell Brad?
Well, it was a surprise, Brad.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Surprise. Surprise. I think you're invited.
Oh, I'll
You
look.
might be moderating. Who knows?
More
I'll
than
look
likely.
through my emails.
That's right. But we're hosting an all-day M&A day, Thursday, part of the pre-show. So given that this is the theme here, let's talk about that a little bit. What should people expect to learn here and, even get a hold of you guys if you're there? So their CEO will be there, Michael Byrd.
Well, I think what I'm very excited about, the summit that I'm hearing about for the first time ever,
Perfect.
is really thinking about there's so many different avenues for a group when they're trying to figure out what to do. We have speakers coming in talking about getting themselves sales ready, the things to consider from that perspective. So those who are not sure about what they want to do or even what does it look like to be sales ready, then we'll have a group come up there and talk about what the process is. I hear there's a law firm that's going to be up there and really walking people through the 5 phases of a deal so they understand that process they're going through. I also am excited about the fact that there are going to be people up there who are going to talk about, from a larger perspective as to how big groups look at deal flow. What are they looking at? And then the final group that I'm really excited about is having people who sold their business telling their story about what they went through to get there. Because I think from someone who's trying to figure out, well, that sounds great. I think I kind of understand now the legal and I understand what's going to happen from the financial side, but has anyone ever done this and what is it like from their perspective? And hearing it from the actual Lily, the seller's mouth up there, I think that's going to be a great way for people to have a good core understanding of the entire process. And I think it's going to be a lot. It's going to be like a fire hose that day of information, but I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, I mean, we started the conversation today talking about how we built everything based on education. Deciding to sell your business is perhaps the biggest decision that you're going to make in the life cycle of your business. And probably every med spa owner out there has heard the term private equity by now and is at a minimum probably curious but may not fully understand. And so the hope with a day like this is to be armed with information. Like, what is it really like? Both the opportunity, which is amazing, and the hard work that goes into it, the investment in time, energy, and money that goes into executing on this kind of a strategy, and hopefully just having a clear perspective of what it would look like to go down this road.
And the only thing I'd add to that is this is the 3rd year that you guys have been putting this event together. And what I've learned is there are people in that room who haven't started the med spa yet, but they had that end in mind, and they wanted to understand what did I have to do from day one. And then in that room are also people who are trying to go to that spot and try to figure out, is private equity as sexy as you guys making them out to be? What does the world really look like? So it's a really interesting spectrum of individuals in that room, meaning that anyone could be there, meaning that you don't have to be near the end or scaling or in the M&A season.
And that's going to be fun. Like, we're going to have some interaction this year with some of the different things that we're going to roll out there, which will be fun to kind of get, start to pull the crowd a little bit too. And, I think for us, it's fun to just, really just have true sellers in the audience or people who are thinking about that process. And so, understanding how everyone's feeling, getting the attitude of the audience and what they're kind of looking for, I think will be fun. We haven't done that before, so that's something that, I'm excited about.
Yeah.
It appears Brad's going to be there now too, so that's good.
I just saw it pop up in my invite.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for the invite.
Yeah, thanks for sending that, Laney.
Good job, Lenny.
No, I mean, I love everything you guys said. And I mean, ultimately what we're talking about here is education. And I think that's the fun part. And, to your point, Michael, and then Brad, to your point, it doesn't matter what phase you are in your business. I mean, this is meant to be educational. You'll get to hear from people who are in your where you want to be 5-10 years from now, maybe on the seller side. And then an interesting one that you mentioned, Michael, is everyone knows what private equity is now. If you look back to year one of this thing, like, it was so new, people didn't know. So it's been fun year over year to add a little bit more to it. And Brad mentioned, what do buyers look for when they buy these platforms that are being put together? And that'll be fun because hopefully it'll get people thinking about, from a deal structure perspective, private equity is calling everybody. From a deal structure perspective, you really need to be careful because you're going to be rolling over some of that. into their equity. So you want to be sure that it's going to turn into something, monetize into something. And so that bigger buyer group buying the initial one, I think, is going to maybe open people's minds a little bit on that, which will be a lot of fun.
So I'm curious for you, what are you most excited about? Because, I mean, you had this vision 3 years ago of bringing education, M&A to the lower middle market, to this space. So what's kind of going through your mind?
I think everything that's already been said today. I mean, just being able to educate business owners to where, Michael said it, this is the most important business decision they'll make. We say it, this is for most of us who own businesses, a top 5 life decision.
Yeah.
And to be able to give it that respect, I think is super important. And we know these business owners, they're our friends, and the blood, sweat, and tears that they pour into it, for us, it's a passion. It's something we take very seriously, that they get the right value for their business, but also that they know enough to be sure that they realize that not every buyer is the same. It goes beyond a paycheck into who am I partnering with. So I think that's the part I'm most excited about.
And the thing I'll add to this is 3 years ago, we were in that room, and there were a lot of people saying, is private equity really interested in this space? That was the question we got more than once, until private equity did get on stage and threw out very interesting words. But dry powder. But where what I thought was interesting, you and I were in Colorado recently, the number of buyers now in the space. What was the number that y'all have just in your portfolio?
We have 208 as of 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So
it went from, are there really private equity groups interested? And Ben can, and the Skytale team has 208 that they're saying, yes, they are, and we have got those relationships.
And even the flip side of that was private equity was asking us, is there enough med spas out there for us to get enough EBITDA to grow? So it was this conundrum of is there more of them or is there more of us? What does that look like? So yeah, it's been interesting just how it's gone.
So this has been a lot of fun. Are there any, final points or nuggets you want to be sure people take home with them?
I think that the biggest takeaway is, y'all have all said it, that, keep educating yourself in this space. There's a lot of different articles out there. Obviously, this podcast is out there, but go out there and attend these type of meetings to learn about it. Don't, and I think we've talked about this before, otherwise, don't take that unsolicited offer. Learn about it, understand what you need to do to get your house in order so that you can get that lifetime changing moment where you're selling your business for the numbers you could never imagine. So that would be my big takeaway.
Mine is there's a mindset shift for someone that's a small business owner. They run their practice, and they have that mindset of I'm going to take care of my business, and then all the other stuff is ancillary. When you start to look at scaling, it's starting to take things at a whole new level and getting ready, for all the things that we talked about today.
How about
I'm
you,
super
James,
proud.
and then close us out?
Yeah, no, I was going to say I'm super proud as attorneys. We didn't say it depends once today.
Good point.
I said
know.
it like 12 times in my head.
I had the mental counter going. I was at a big fat 0. So, but no, I mean, for us, it's always fun. The reason I think I enjoy every day here is we create generational wealth is the way I kind of, look at it. And so being able to take part in that and, not only the M&A day and sharing the education around the space, but just the day-to-day work that y'all do, that we do, and just seeing progression along the way of how not only the industry has grown, but how the people in the industry have grown and learned. And so, yeah, that's really for me where it comes down to and why we have so much fun here. So, as Ben mentioned, we love having y'all. Thank you guys for joining us. And we'll see everyone soon.
Thank
It
you.
was fun.
Thank you.